Okay, hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's colloquium speaker, Professor Benjamin Lindner. Professor
Mhm.
Lindner is a leading figure in the field of theoretical physics, specializing in the theory of complex system and neurophysics. He holds a professorship at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience, Berlin, and the physics department at the Humboldt University at Berlin. So Professor Lindner's research bridged the physics and neuroscience, focusing on the stochastic dynamics of neural systems and the mathematical modeling of neural activity. His work has contributed significantly to our understanding of how random fluctuation and noise influence the behavior of the neural networks, both at the level of individual neurons and large-scale brain circuit. Notably, his publication addressed topics such as variability of spike train in cortical networks and the theoretical underpinning of the neural information processing. In addition to his research, Professor Lindner is recognized for his commitment to interdisciplinary collaboration and education, mentoring students and postdocs at the intersection of physics, mathematics, and neuroscience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin Lindner.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and in particular, in the first place, to inviting me here to this colloquium series on biomedical mathematics. It's a great pleasure and also an honor. What I'm going to talk about today is the simplified description of stochastic oscillators, and let me start by motivating a little bit what we are doing here, because this is on biomedical mathematics. It's um, it's indicated really to pick examples from biology, and so I did here. So you see here various physical observables or biological observables, I should say, that vary over scales, both in space and in time. So here in the left upper corner, by the way, you can see my pointer, yeah? Is
Yes.
that so?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So for the prey-predator system, you see here numbers of whole animals, yeah, prey and predators that show these oscillations, these famous oscillations
Mhm.
that have been observed, I think, for the first time in Canada,
Mhm.
and they are pretty noisy. Yeah, so that this is not really a very precise oscillation. So you have fluctuations here both in the amplitude and in the phase. The next example is a little organelle that plays a very important role in our inner ear organs. That's the hair bundle. And you see that the deflections of this bundle, this is only tens of nanometers here, so we are on a completely different scale now, is also shaped by fluctuations. But there is definitely also an oscillatory component to it. Then, of course, there is the neural firing that can be also regarded as an oscillation or noise-induced oscillation in an excitable system. And here in the right upper corner, you have the intracellular calcium oscillation and genetic oscillations. So very, very different systems in time scales ranging from tens or hundreds of milliseconds to hundreds of days. Yeah, but what they all have in common is they all happen far from thermodynamic equilibrium. Most of the time, the underlying mechanism is supposedly strongly nonlinear, and you see a lot of noise here at the output. Okay. Now, there is a large variability in observed stochastic oscillations, but there is also large variability of models. How do you model those stochastic
Mhm.
oscillations mathematically? Now, the simplest model that would come to mind, maybe at least for a person from physics as myself, is a harmonic oscillator. Yeah? So if you endow a harmonic oscillator with damping and with noise, so you put a Brownian particle, put it here on a spring and embed it in a heat bath, and this is an undamped particle, then you see these waxing and waning oscillations that are typical for this kind of system. You could also pick a system that already deterministically oscillates, like a limit cycle system or a relaxation oscillator, and you endow it with noise, and you also get the
Mhm.
stochastic oscillation. More exciting are probably systems where only by the effect of noise you get oscillations at all. So they would not oscillate at all if you would not have noise in the system. And among these systems are the excitable systems, models for neurons like the Hodgkin-Huxley model or Morris-Lekar or Fitz-Nagumo, or also more exotic systems like this noisy heteroclinic system, about which I will also talk in the following a bit. Okay, now we are interested in the dynamics of all these noisy mathematical models, applying them also to biological examples, for instance, the hair bundle system that I've mentioned before. We are also interested in how do these systems respond to external stimuli. We are also interested how do they behave if you couple them together, if you have collective effects in groups of such noisy oscillators. And to this end, we would like to have a simplified description that is comparable to the phase description that people have used for deterministic oscillators, for instance, to describe synchronization effects in weakly coupled networks of deterministic oscillators. So here, now the stage is set, hopefully, and you know what the problem is. This is the outline of my talk. I will start with a reminder of what is the phase description in deterministic models and how people have over the last 10, 15 years tried to generalize that to stochastic systems. I will then quickly drop the phase description and come to a slightly more complicated framework, the Q function. This is a mapping not to a real number, the phase, but to a complex pointer. And it will turn out that this kind of mapping will simplify the description really tremendously. And I will demonstrate how this happens and discuss several aspects, such as the response to external signals and the coupling among the cross spectrum or the cross correlations of coupled elements and the synchronization of coupled elements. Okay, so let me start with the phase description of deterministic oscillators. What is that? Let's assume we have a system that has a limit cycle. This is the limit cycle gamma here, and there is a domain of attraction. For this limit cycle, then you can ascribe a real number to every point in this domain of attraction. That's called the phase. Yeah, and how do you find this? You can find it via two distinct definitions that are completely equivalent to each other, as it turns out. So one is the return time phase. So points that belong to the same manifold, to the same phase, so to speak, they will return after one period of the limit cycle to the very same manifold.
Mhm.
And that's one definition. Isochrones are the manifolds to which the trajectories return after one period. And the other one uses the asymptotic properties of the density of the time evolution of our trajectories. We go, so to speak, backward in time, and we say that two points belong to the same phase if they end up at the same time-dependent point on the limit cycle in a long-term limit. Okay? So these two definitions, the return time phase and the asymptotic phase, they agree with each other. They are equivalent with each other. You then need only one more characteristics of the system, the so-called phase resetting curve, and you can, for instance, study how such oscillators respond to external signals, how they couple with each other, or how they synchronize or not synchronize with each other if you couple them in specific ways, and so on and so forth. So this was a very successful concept, I would say, over the last 50 years or so. And for that reason, people were tempted to look for the generalization of the phase in the stochastic case.
Mhm.
And two such suggestions have been made. So there is the mean return time phase by Schwabedal and Pikowski, which is based pretty much um, on this stroboscopic definition of the return after one period. The period is here simply replaced by the mean rotation time of the oscillator. And the second definition is the asymptotic phase that is based on the complex phase of the eigenfunction. I will explain that in detail because the talk is pretty much about this
Mhm.
concept. Okay, so let me elaborate on this or give you an example. This heteroclinic oscillator that I have mentioned before. This is an interesting system because it would not show any oscillations in the absence of noise. It is built such a way that you have an unstable fixed point in the middle
Mhm.
and you have four saddle points here in the corner. And if you have no noise, then you see the trajectory here. One of the components is shown here, slows down infinitely, yeah, in the system, and you don't have oscillations. But if you add a little bit of noise, and this is here white Gaussian noise, independent white Gaussian noise, the two components side one and side two, then you observe beautiful
Mm.
oscillations, almost really nicely regular. Yeah, not of course perfectly regular. There's noise in the system, but the noise helps you to get around the corner, so to speak. Yeah, and you get a well-defined period for these kind of oscillations. For this system, we can now ask, what is the phase? Can we find a mapping from the point x1 and x2 to a real number that we can call the phase? And our definition is based not on a single trajectory, but on the evolution of a whole ensemble. Imagine that I start a bunch of trajectories here, all at the same value, say here in the left lower corner. And then I look at the evolution of an ensemble of such trajectories. What will happen is shown here in this little animation. The peak of probability will travel around the square. Yeah, you see that. And it will lose its phase coherence in the long run, obviously, and you will end up with a stationary probability density. So we do not have the nice property of the deterministic oscillator where you end up with a time-dependent point on a limit cycle. No, the density will simply end up at the stationary density. However, there is a slowest component in this density, so there is still some oscillatory wobbling around here of the density. And this can be described by a certain function. And this is how we
Mhm.
gain a concept of a phase.
Mm.
Now I will get a little more formal here and introduce really the framework. So what we consider here are systems that are described by n-dimensional systems of Langevin equations, of stochastic differential equations. I choose here for that slide the physics notation where we really have a differential equation that is driven here by white noise. And to this equation is associated a forward Kolmogorov equation, also known as the Fokker-Planck equation, and a backward equation that describes the evolution of the probability density of an ensemble of trajectories either forward in time or backward in time. Yeah, so this P, Y, T condition on XS tells you how much realizations of the process will sit around the point Y at time T, given that we have started them at point X at an earlier time S. Now, these partial differential equations are here characterized by differential operators L and L dagger. And L dagger is in particular also known as the stochastic Koopman operator. And L dagger and L have eigenvalue equations. These two equations are, of course, adjoint, and these are the adjoint operators. And so the eigenvalues are the same, but the eigenfunctions are, of course, different. They fulfill this bi-orthogonal relation here. And you can expand the time-dependent density. That is exactly the thing that I showed you in the movie before, yeah, by these eigenfunctions. And you see that the slowest mode that we will have before we reach the stationary density, that is this one here, the slowest mode will be associated with the eigenvalue that has the smallest real part, yeah, because that shows the weakest or the slowest decay in this sum.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as it turns out, for a robust stochastic oscillator, you will find that this dominating eigenvalue, this eigenvalue with the smallest real part, is complex. So it consists of mu1, which will be a negative real number, and I omega 1, where omega 1 is pretty much the oscillation frequency of the stochastic oscillator. Now, with Peter Thomas from the Case Western Reserve University, we have worked this out and we have found that an appropriate phase description for an asymptotic phase is if we take simply the complex argument of this q lambda 1 function. So the eigenfunction of the backward operator or stochastic.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Hello?
Okay,
I'm sorry, there was an
you,
internet issue. Sorry.
okay. Do
Mm.
I have to agree
Yeah, please
again
go. Yeah,
to?
yeah, yeah. Or maybe 1 minute back. Yes.
I don't see really where I have to
I think just
agree
30
to.
seconds, something like that.
Okay, so I go back in my talk.
I think just one slide. Yeah, here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just saying that one can describe, or a very valid phase description is to pick the complex argument of this q lambda 1 function. This is the eigenfunction of the backward operator that belongs to the eigenvalue with the smallest non-vanishing real part. Yeah, of course, there's always, if you go back here to my expansion, there's also, of course, also the eigenvalue 0
Mhm.
that we represent here by this extra term. That's the stationary probability distribution to which this probability density will converge in the long run. But the slowest time-dependent thing that happens is characterized by p lambda 1 and q lambda 1. And we pick here the complex argument of this q lambda 1, which is a complex valued function. And this is our phase, and we can
Mhm.
show that this converges to the deterministic phase.
Mhm.
Okay, we can apply that to this system where we have no asymptotic phase in a noiseless limit. And consequently, as you make the noise smaller and smaller,
Mhm.
the isoclines, so the lines of the same phase, become more curly and more curly, yeah,
Mhm.
as you let the noise intensity shrink. We have also picked an example that has a deterministic phase, and that is this one. This is the so-called Izhikevich model with channel noise. So this whole thing also works if you have parts in your density equation that are more equivalent to a master equation than to a Fokker-Planck equation. So you have discrete noise, but it's still a Markov process. Also for that case, you can determine the asymptotic phase in the way that I've sketched. Yeah, so here you see the eigenvalue spectrum, you see the dominating pair of complex eigenvalues. And you see in particular, if you take infinitely many channels, that would be in the scaling here with channel noise, the case of a deterministic oscillator. If you take a large number of channels, the isoclines become very similar to that of the deterministic system. That's only a numerical illustration of
Mhm.
what I said before, that this converges to the right phase.
Let's see.
Now, I should mention there this alternative phase definition by Schwabedal and Pikowski also converges to the correct phase if you switch off the noise and you have a deterministic phase in the first place. We had a little bit of arguments here, an exchange of arguments. What is the better phase? They are different, the two phases, if you have a finite noise level, and it's still an open issue. What is now really the difference between them, and when is which phase more appropriate. I should also mention this whole thing has been generalized to amplitude phase descriptions, in particular here with my dear collaborator Alberto Perez Cervera. And I should also mention work by Hiroya Nakao, who will talk actually next week, yeah,
Yeah,
in this
correct.
same seminar
Yeah.
series, who has put forward with his collaborators also
Hmm.
results on such a phase amplitude description. And he will say more about that, I'm sure, and very interesting things next week. Okay, now this is all good and well. We have studied this phase. We have studied also the two different phases. We have also put forward, by the way, a partial differential equation that determines the mean return time phase by Schwabedal and Pikowski, so that you don't have to use an algorithm to determine the isochrones, but they come out as a solution of a partial differential equation and so on. So you can compare the different phase concepts and so on. But so far, they were not that extremely useful for the problems that I've mentioned in the beginning. So considering coupled oscillators, coupled stochastic oscillators, or their response to external stimuli. And we had a new idea more recently, about 2 years ago, to describe a noisy oscillator not by a phase, by one real value, but rather perform a mapping to a complex pointer. So instead of mapping to the complex argument of the Q lambda function, what if we take the Q lambda function itself? And this idea is now to do all the numerics for it and to go through with all the proofs is largely here the contribution of a young professor from Spain, Alberto Perez Cervera. So the slides that you see in the following are very much related to his work and what we did when he was on a sabbatical here in Berlin,
Hmm.
visiting me 2 years ago.
Oh.
Okay, so what is the advantage of making a mapping not to a real number, a phase,
Hmm.
but to this complex pointer? The
Hmm.
advantage is that the statistics of the spontaneous fluctuations becomes extremely simple, that the response to an external stimulus becomes extremely simple, and that we get also explicit results for the cross correlation statistics of weakly coupled oscillators. Yeah, so that's comparable to what has been achieved with the deterministic phase description. And also, I should say, synchronization can be well defined, as I will show in the very end of my talk.
Hmm.
And now, to make this more comprehensible, I will introduce in the next couple of slides three distinct models of stochastic oscillators, really distinct mathematical models, and show you that they can be described in a unified manner by our mapping to this Q lambda function. And the first example is was mentioned already in passing. That's the harmonic oscillator with damping and noise. So I write it up as maybe people see it when they study physics. So x dot is equal v. So the position derivative is the velocity, and then mass times acceleration is the sum of the forces, which are a Stokes friction term proportional to velocity. It's restoring force from, say, a linear spring or Hookean spring. And then we also add here noise, and you could imagine that's, for instance, thermal noise. It's really a Brownian particle attached to a spring and subject to friction and fluctuations. Now, if you plot the phase space trajectory of the system, it looks really noisy. It's also
Hmm.
Gaussian distributed in both of these variables. If you plot the trajectory and you choose here the underdamped regime
Hmm.
of this parameter regime, then you see this waxing and waning oscillations that are characteristic for the system. The spectrum of eigenvalues looks really like a polka dot pattern here, but we single out this first leading pair here,
Hmm.
lambda 1,
Hmm.
which is complex conjugated,
Uh-huh.
and For this system, you can actually find the eigenvalues because it's a linear system and the eigenfunctions analytically, and the Q1 function in particular is just a linear combination of x and v. Okay, and you can choose parameters with less damping or with more damping, and accordingly you get either more coherent oscillations, as I've shown you before, or less coherent oscillations. So here you can argue, is this really an oscillation or not? But it's a borderline case, yeah, with a really small quality factor. My second example is a noisy Stewart-Landau oscillator. So in this system, you have some nonlinearity. And if you would switch off the noise, the system would go to a limit cycle, which is here simply the circle, and it would travel on the circle. And if you now add noise in the two components, then you get noise both in the amplitude and the phase. And you see that the oscillations now look really different to what I showed you before for the harmonic oscillator. And also here, we can tweak the parameters such that we have more coherent oscillations and less coherent oscillations. And by the way, I will also tweak the parameters, or actually, I should say, Alberto has tweaked the parameters such that we have exactly the same eigenvalues as for the two cases of the harmonic oscillator. So the pair of eigenvalues is the same. This will turn out to be crucial here in the following. My third example is a SNIC system, so a saddle node on an invariant circle system with noise. So this has some interesting asymmetry, a slower part of the dynamics where the system slows down on the way down. It is here x1 plotted, so this slows down, and then there's a very rapid increase in the upward motion. Yeah? So this has an interesting asymmetry also in the system, and you can here even choose in the less coherent oscillation case an excitable regime. So here we will have a fixed point and stable fixed point and an unstable fixed point, and this unstable fixed point can be only overcome by the effect of noise. So these oscillations, if you want to call them oscillations, are really induced by noise in that case. Now we have these three example systems. Their trajectories look really different, as you see here. Their power spectra, for instance, look really different. They all peak at the same frequency. That's due to the fact that we tweak the parameters such that the lambda 1 value is always the same. However, power spectra are really different. Trajectories are really different. Now, what happens if we look through the glasses of the leading backward eigenfunction is the following, that say for the power spectra or the autocorrelation function in this new variable, you make this mapping, you stick your nonlinear, your trajectory x of t, you stick it into this nonlinear function, you map it to this complex pointer, and then you calculate the autocorrelation function for this pointer variable, or you calculate the power spectrum for the pointer variable, and you find that this is completely expressed by this eigenvalue lambda 1. Yeah, lambda 1 was mu1 plus I omega 1, by the way, and you see that these three very distinct systems that have really distinct mechanisms for stochastic oscillations, they all are exactly described in this new variable by a complex exponential, if you look in the time domain for the autocorrelation function, and by the Lorentz power spectrum that is centered at the imaginary part of our eigenvalue, and the width of which is determined by the real part of the same eigenvalue, so by mu1. Now,
Benjamin,
again,
in the previous slide, so if I understand correctly, you got this Q star XT, and then for the time series data, you calculate this Fourier transform, that's the A.
Right.
Okay,
right.
so now we rather than looking at
both of these functions are a Fourier pair according to the Wiener Khinchin theory.
Yeah.
So the power spectrum Fourier transform of
Yeah.
the autocorrelation.
So
right?
basically, what you do is rather than x of t, you change it to the q star xt as a new time series, and then you do all this analysis.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And then all the statistics fall on the exactly the same line. And this that is not a weak noise theory as people often employ, but you can also to go to the very not so less coherent case that is here in the lower panel,
Yes.
and it all works like a charm, and it should work like a charm, as I show you in a couple of slides. I
Uh-huh.
just want to remind you what we are doing here. We take the system's backward equation, this operator, we solve the eigenvalue problem. This is, by the way, not simple. Yeah, this is the non-trivial step in the whole endeavor here.
Mhm.
And then when we gain this function, this is a function of my variables x, x1, x2, and so on up to xn. And now what I do is I stuck the trajectory into this function. I get two new variables, the real part and the imaginary part of q lambda at that specific x of t. And I take the time series, this complex value time series, and I
Hmm.
do analysis of it.
Okay.
Right. So one question is still, how is this q lambda function normalized? You find very quickly that the stationary mean value should vanish. This is a consequence of this bi-orthogonality relation here. And the variance can be normalized to 1. That is what we pick here. And then there's still a phase offset, but that's not a problem for the power spectrum. Just to show you that this is really simple, I show you here my handwritten, hopefully readable
Uh-huh.
calculation for the autocorrelation function.
Uh-huh.
So you take q lambda 1 of t and q lambda complex conjugated at t plus tau for positive tau here, then you can express that by a double integral
Mhm.
over the transition probability. So the 2 times probability density, essentially, if you multiply that with the stationary density here. And then you express this py tau simply via the eigenfunction expansion. And then you see that if you apply the bi-orthogonality relation to all these integrals, then only one term survives, and that is the term with the lambda 1 time. And then we also use here that we define the variance to be 1 according to our normalization, and what results exactly is a pure exponential. It's of course a complex exponential because we deal with a stochastic oscillator. The lambda 1 is a complex number, mu1 plus I omega 1. Yeah, and that's how we end up with this exact result and the power spectrum. So what you can also do is you can calculate the cross spectrum between different Q functions. Yeah, we don't have only one Q function, but we have several of them belonging to all the eigenvalues. If you look at the this spectrum. So you have here q lambda 1, but here you have another pair of eigenvalues, and you could now calculate the cross spectrum with the between the eigenfunctions that belong to the different eigenvalues. And we find here an expression for it, and we can test this. For instance, for the SNCC model, you see here always colors, and then you see lines. One is the theory,
Mhm.
and one are the simulations. And I don't remember which one is which, but they agree with each other perfectly anyway. Okay, so these are the spontaneous activity that we can perfectly describe in this framework. However, there's more to it. We can drive the system externally in a certain direction in our state space with along a vector E and perturb it in a time-dependent manner from the outside. Then we know that the time-dependent mean value of this is sufficiently weak, will follow from this relation. This is simply linear response theory according to Kubo,
Mhm.
where Ke is simply the response function. And this can be also characterized by the susceptibility, the linear response function in frequency domain. Now, the beauty of our Q approach is that if you do the calculation, then the response function turns out to be proportional to the very same exponential function that we found for the autocorrelation function. And accordingly, the susceptibility is now a linear, so the frequency, the Fourier transform of our response function is this first order filter, a very simple expression. And you may wonder what this prefactor is. The prefactor is determined by our Q1 function and the gradient of our stationary density. And what enters here is the dot product between the direction of perturbation and this gradient. So this will affect only the amplitude of our response function, but not really the time course of it. Now, I also want to, one can check this now for the different systems, for instance, for the harmonic oscillator. And you see here a wiggly line. That's simply the response function determined by really applying such a time-dependent stimulus at the different frequencies and measuring its response and so on. And the other curve, the more light curve, is simply the theory, which nicely agrees. Of course, for a harmonic oscillator, you can calculate in the original variables the response characteristics analytically exactly. So, but even that is more complicated than this expression. Yeah, so it's a second order polynomial in the denominator here in the frequency. Now let's pick a nonlinear example, the Stewart-Landau oscillator, which was an isotropic limit cycle system that we endowed here with a little bit of white Gaussian noise in both components. And here you see that it doesn't really matter whether I apply my perturbation in one component or the other because of the isotropy of the system. You see only one curve, and the reason is that the red and the blue are on top of each other, so you don't see really a difference. And they agree both with the theory. So, and you have here only a phase shift due to the fact that you applied it in a different component. So the phase shift would be like how the system lags behind your driving, external driving. For the SNCC system, it's more interesting because here we have an asymmetry in X1 and X2. So it's more efficient if you drive the system with a periodic drive in X1 because you help the system to overcome the slow region here. Yeah, and that's why the response in X1, that's the red one, is much larger than the response if you stimulate in X2. But both agree here, again with this formula, only this prefactor is different if we drive in X1 than if we drive in X2. Now, I also want to mention in passing that we obtain here as a byproduct a very nice and simple relation between the spontaneous fluctuations and the linear response. It's the same exponential function, unfortunately written here in different ways. Sorry for that, but maybe you see that it is still the same function. So what we find here is a very simple so-called fluctuation dissipation theorem, or you could also call it a fluctuation response relation, which has not been derived before. Yeah? So it's a fluctuation response relation that holds for the specific new variables given by the Q number one function. Now, let me come to the case of two coupled oscillators. Can we describe the interaction also in terms of the Q functions? And here we need a little bit something new as well. So the setup that we consider here are two oscillators that are coupled here, that oscillate on their own. X dot is equal to fx. But there are also coupling terms here. In particular, this here is the effect of oscillator Y on oscillator X. This is the effect of oscillator X on oscillator Y. And we have also, just for symmetry reasons here, so to speak, self-coupling terms in there that we could also include in the drift, but we keep them here for certain reasons. And then the system is perturbed by noise again. In this setup, if we make a linear ansatz for the interaction, this is really a non-trivial thing because we assume this here to be valid realization-wise. Yeah? If we make this ansatz and expand our coupling functions in terms of our backward eigenfunctions, yeah, this is a complete set of eigenfunctions, so we can expand any arbitrary functions into these eigenfunctions, then by means of certain coefficients that are obtained here in terms of our eigenfunctions, we can compute an expression for the cross spectrum of two weakly coupled stochastic oscillators that are given in terms of the susceptibility of one of the systems, this complex valued coefficient that I've mentioned on the previous slide, and the cross spectra between the different eigenfunctions here of the Y oscillator. So that was the thing that I showed you an expression for a couple of slides ago. Yeah, and then you have a second term where the role of the two oscillators switch. Yeah, so you have the susceptibility of the Y oscillator and you have the cross spectra between the different Q modes in the X oscillator and so on. This can be tested, for instance, for two coupled harmonic oscillators. Here you can also compare to the cross spectrum between X and Y anyway. So these are the original variables. And you see that the information that these carry here is somehow maintained also in the cross spectrum between Q1x and Q1y. So we make now the transformation to the eigenfunctions and we look at the cross spectrum between these two modes. So this is pretty similar. Of course, again, for harmonic oscillators, you can also calculate these cross spectra analytically. So it's not really a challenge here, but we see that the cross spectrum between Q1x and Q1y has a similar information as the cross spectra of the original variables. You can also use now two coupled SNC systems, and it turns out this here is a sum over all the arbitrary cross spectra of the modes. So this is still complicated. You would also have to calculate all the cross spectra here. However, it turns out we can just survive with the first dominant term, and the dominant term is the power spectrum. Yeah? So that would be the cross spectrum between the first mode and the first mode. That's simply the power spectrum. And that makes the largest contribution here. And in particular, if we deal with the case of a coherent oscillator, then you get a very nice agreement. If you have a not so coherent oscillator, then you may need more terms in the sum, and that's illustrated here. If you take only the first term, then you would get this dashed line, and you would in particular miss this negative lope here. But if you go up to first five modes, then you pretty much capture what is obtained in the simulation. You can also look at oscillators that are slightly detuned, and then you see that in the cross spectrum, the two oscillator frequencies still emerge. Yeah? So, and we have tested that for more cases, so we can have a look at the PNAS paper. And in all cases where we have a weak coupling, we have seen that this theory really well describes, really in detail, those cross spectra. Now, finally, I'd like to come to the point, what happens if we more strongly couple these oscillators? Can we use this Q function framework also describe what people have called stochastic synchronization? So synchronization between stochastic oscillators. And it turns out that the Q function framework allows for a new definition of synchronization, and that's called Q synchronization. That's a very brand new contribution that is largely due to this young man here, Maxwell Crider, who just defended his PhD thesis in the group of Peter Thomas. And he pursued the idea to regard the full system of two coupled oscillators as just one big system, and to consider the Q function for this greater system, for this bigger system, and to analyze what happens there with the eigenvalues. Okay? And it turns out that this gives you a new definition of synchronization between stochastic oscillators. And let me just introduce here the framework, which is slightly different than the one that we have seen before. First of all, this is here the math notation for stochastic differential equations. So these dWs are now the increments of a Brownian motion, okay, which make math people happy. And then we have two oscillators that would be, if tau is equals 0, kappa equals 0, happily oscillate with the same frequency because their deterministic drift functions are identical here. You see f of x and f of y. Now we make them slightly different by two functions u1 and u2 that are different, and this is scaled by a detuning parameter tau. Okay, then they are both coupled in a symmetric fashion, and the coupling strength is kappa, and this is not necessarily weak. That can be also stronger. And then we have noise that depends only in the amplitude, potentially on x and on y, respectively. Okay, that's the setup. For this full system, you can write down now an eigenvalue problem for the backward eigenfunctions and the forward eigenfunctions. And as a matter of fact, if the two oscillators are only slightly detuned and say weakly coupled, then we will find that we have now two eigenvalues that are neighboring, yeah, that are not identical, but they're close by. So you do not fulfill anymore this assumption that we made that we have a well-separated first dominating eigenvalue, but we have actually two eigenvalues, and we have also two eigenfunctions that belong to the two eigenvalues. And now what Max has put forward here is that we can define Q synchronization happening if something qualitatively changes for these eigenvalues. And I will tell you what happens for a very simple example, namely two foci, so linear systems, 2D linear systems that have a focus point in the origins. So they show some damped oscillations that's somehow equivalent to the damped harmonic oscillator that I showed you before, but a little bit more symmetric in the two variables. And we have two of them. We couple them. They are detuned because the first oscillator has a frequency omega plus tau. The other one has a frequency omega. And what you now see is as you crank up the coupling between the oscillators is that initially you see the two detuned values of the frequency in the imaginary part of the respective eigenvalues. And then at some point, at the so-called KT point, these two imaginary parts melt together or they unify, and you have only one of them left. And that's the point where the two systems synchronize, so to speak, and where the two Q functions also attain a different interpretation or meaning. There are now really two modes of a big stochastic oscillator. Yeah? So this whole thing, the four-dimensional system, has now become really only one oscillator. And so you can repeat that for different combinations of detuning and coupling. And what you find is inside this green region, you have only one imaginary part for the two eigenvalues, and outside you have two. So outside you can say you still have two separate oscillators that oscillate with their own frequencies. Inside you have synchronization, but only looked through the lens of the Q function. Yeah. So it's also instructive to look at the power spectra. If you look at the power spectra in these Q functions, the two Q functions that you obtain from the full system here, then if you have a weak coupling, so where you're at a value does not really in the parameters, by the way, couple correspond to these plots here above. So here the detuning is larger and also the coupling will be larger. Yeah, but it's somehow equivalent, the situation to what you have here on the left. So you have two separated peaks, power spectra, and also in the original variables, you will have separate power spectra. This here corresponds to the critical coupling, to something like that. And here you see that you have the same eigenvalue and you will also have the same eigenfunctions correspondingly. And that's why the power spectra completely agree. But only in this Q function, in the original variable, there's slightly different still. There's still also a difference here in the peak frequency. And then if you go to even stronger coupling, then you get a very peaked function. And now it turns into a big oscillator where you have a well-defined first mode, yeah, that has a real part that is much smaller than that of the next eigenvalue, which is much larger, which is here associated with the width of the peak. More examples you can find in the paper. So I think my time is up. Let me summarize what I told you, in particular in the second part. And the first part was about the stochastic phase, but then I try to convince you that it may be more meaningful to make a transformation to a complex pointer, this Q lambda 1 function. And if we do so, then we get very simple power spectra. They are given simply by Lorentz functions. We get exponential autocorrelation functions. The response to external perturbation is very simple. It's just a first order linear filter. Weakly coupled stochastic oscillators can be characterized by their cross spectra. For these cross spectra, we have simple expressions that are also interpretable. And I should also point out that is something that I didn't really do, but you can really in this way also describe or compare distinct stochastic oscillators with each other. So a simple comparison becomes possible in that way, even for oscillators that live in different states, spaces of different physical dimensions, for instance. Yeah? Because you map all of them to a stochastic pointer. And finally, in this brand new work that is only available at the archive at the moment, I showed you that Q functions help to define bifurcation of strongly coupled stochastic oscillators. And yeah, I just want to mention various generalizations
Mhm.
of the theory are possible. For instance, going beyond two coupled oscillators, but n coupled oscillators and networks and so on. And we hope that this will be applied and will help to understand stochastic systems better in the future. Okay, and with that, I'm at the end. I'd like to acknowledge the excellent collaborations that I had here with different people and the hard work that, in particular, Alberto Perez Cervera put in here, and in particular also Maxwell Kreider, the PhD student of Peter Thomas. With Peter Thomas and Boris Kutkin, I have long years of collaboration, which have been always a pleasure. And here I list a couple of references if you have become curious about the things that I had to tell you. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm waiting for some questions.
Okay, thanks so much. So it's a Q&A time, so let me turn up the record.